The first thing I noticed was her laugh. Soft, rehearsed, perfectly timed for the kind of restaurant where every candle looked expensive and every table faced the ocean like a private stage. I was halfway through my sea bass when Ethan reached across the table and tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear with the same careful tenderness he used on me before our marriage became calendar notifications and polite silence. Santorini was supposed to be where we celebrated 10 years together. Instead, I watched my husband toast his assistant beneath white stone arches glowing gold against the sunset while violin music drifted through the terrace. He had told me he was in Chicago for a leadership conference. I remember staring at the reservation card beside my wine glass when the waiter quietly set it down by mistake. Happy anniversary, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. My name wasn't on it. Hers was. Vanessa Cole. 26 years old. Executive assistant. I should have cried, maybe screamed, maybe walked over and shattered the wine glass against the table the way women do in movies when betrayal finally corners them. But I didn't move. I simply lifted my phone, opened our shared investments account, and started reading the transaction history very carefully. Ethan always believed silence meant weakness. That was probably why he stopped noticing mine long before he started sleeping with someone else. Over the last 2 years, our marriage had turned into a performance built around his schedule, his clients, his promotions, his exhaustion. I became the woman who remembered birthdays, handled the taxes, signed for deliveries, smiled through corporate dinners, and quietly cleaned up every mess before anyone else saw it. When he forgot our anniversary the year before, he sent roses to the house with a typed note from his assistant. Vanessa. Even then, I noticed the detail that bothered me most wasn't the flowers, it was that she knew my favorite arrangement. White orchids with blue hydrangeas. Ethan never remembered that. Sitting alone in Santorini while the Aegean water reflected candlelight across the terrace, I realized this affair hadn't started recently. It had been growing inside the spaces where my husband assumed I wasn't paying attention. The late board meetings. The unexplained wire transfers. The sudden password changes. The weekends he insisted on traveling alone. Across the restaurant, Vanessa leaned closer and rested her hand over his wrist while he smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. Then Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small velvet box on the table. I knew the ring wasn't for me before Vanessa even covered her mouth in fake surprise. Ethan had always been predictable when he wanted to impress someone. He leaned back slightly after opening expensive gifts because he liked watching reactions more than giving affection itself. Across the terrace, the sunset painted the white cliffs orange while tourists lifted phones to capture the view, completely unaware that my marriage was quietly collapsing 2 tables away. Vanessa looked around first to see who was watching before she slipped the ring onto her finger, which told me everything I needed to know about her too. Ethan raised his wine glass toward her and said, "I wanted tonight to feel unforgettable." I almost laughed because our actual anniversary was tomorrow. He'd forgotten the date again. My phone vibrated against the table. A message from him. Conference dinner running late. Probably sleeping after this. Love you. I stared at the screen for 3 full seconds before locking it again. Then I opened our joint financial account once more. Ethan handled the public side of our finances because he liked control, but I managed the structures underneath them. Taxes. Property filings. Investment routing. Liability protections. He never understood the system well enough to notice how much access I still had. Over the last 6 months, there had been unusual spending hidden beneath corporate reimbursements, boutique hotels in Miami, jewelry purchases coded as client entertainment, airfare booked 2 days before fake conferences. What caught my attention wasn't the affair itself anymore. It was the withdrawals from Bennett Strategic Holdings, our holding company. The account his board technically wasn't supposed to use without dual authorization. I zoomed in slowly on a wire transfer dated April 14, $75,000 sent to a luxury real estate escrow service in Greece. My stomach stayed calm, but my pulse slowed in that dangerous way it always did right before I made difficult decisions. Ethan wasn't just cheating. He was using company money to build a future with her. I quietly paid my bill and asked the waiter for a copy of the anniversary reservation receipt. He hesitated until I smiled and said, "My husband forgets everything unless I keep records." The waiter handed it over without another question. Ethan never saw me leave the terrace. Back inside my hotel suite, I spread the paperwork across the glass table near the balcony doors and started reading everything carefully. The escrow company name triggered recognition almost immediately. 3 years earlier, Ethan and I had discussed purchasing a vacation property overseas through a shell LLC for tax protection. He lost interest after a week because legal structures bored him. I didn't lose interest, which meant I knew exactly where to look next. By midnight, I had accessed the registration database through our corporate attorney's archived files. The property LLC had already been formed. The managing member listed on the documents was Ethan Bennett. But beneath his name sat something even more important, the originating ownership trust. My trust. Ethan must have reused old formation templates without reading them carefully, assuming the structure belonged entirely to him. Legally, anything purchased through that trust remain under my controlling authority unless explicitly reassigned. The villa he was secretly buying for Vanessa wasn't his asset. It was mine. I sat back in the chair slowly, listening to waves crash below the cliffs outside my balcony while my husband laughed somewhere across Santorini with another woman wearing a ring he probably bought using company funds tied to an asset structure he didn't understand. Most people think revenge arrives as anger. Loud voices. Broken dishes. Public humiliation. But real power usually enters the room quietly. It reads contracts carefully. It waits. And at 1:14 a.m., while Ethan slept beside his assistant in a villa suite billed to Bennett Strategic Holdings, I emailed our corporate attorney a single sentence. Please freeze all pending international property transfers connected to the Andrews Cove Trust until further notice. Ethan called me the next morning at exactly 8:12 a.m., sounding irritated before he even said hello. "Did you authorize a hold on one of the company transfers?" he asked, skipping any performance about Chicago or conferences entirely. I stood barefoot on my hotel balcony in a cream silk robe, coffee warming my hands while the Santorini harbor glittered beneath the morning sun. "Good morning to you too," I said calmly. There was a pause long enough for him to realize I already knew. Then his tone softened into the careful corporate charm he used whenever he wanted control back. "There's a property issue overseas tied to a client acquisition. Legal says the trust owner flagged it." I smiled slightly at the word owner. That sounds inconvenient. Another silence. I could practically hear his brain reorganizing itself around panic. Ethan hated uncertainty more than failure itself. "Listen," he said lower, "I'll explain everything when I get home." Across the street below my balcony, a couple posed for anniversary photos against the ocean while a photographer adjusted the woman's veil in the wind. 10 years earlier, Ethan. And I had looked exactly like that, polished, successful, impossible to embarrass publicly. "No," I answered quietly. "You'll explain it now." He didn't. Instead, he disconnected the call 3 seconds later, which told me he was standing beside Vanessa and couldn't risk the conversation continuing. 20 minutes after that, my phone lit up again. This time it wasn't Ethan. It was Daniel Reeves, CFO of Bennett Strategic Holdings. "Claire," he said carefully, "I just received an alert regarding frozen overseas expenditures. Is there a problem I should know about before the board meeting Monday?" Daniel had worked with us for 7 years. Unlike Ethan, he actually read financial documents before signing them. "There might be," I replied. "How much do you know about the Andrews Cove acquisition?" His silence lasted longer than Ethan's had. "That property wasn't approved by the board," he finally said. "Exactly." By noon, the situation had escalated quietly inside the company. Ethan had attempted to override the transfer hold twice through internal authorization channels, which automatically generated compliance notifications. Worse for him, Bennett Strategic Holdings had entered preliminary merger discussions with a private equity firm 6 weeks earlier, meaning every questionable transaction was now under increased scrutiny. I spent the afternoon reviewing statements from my laptop beside the infinity pool while tourists drank champagne nearby, completely unaware that a multi-million-dollar executive scandal was slowly detonating through New York. Ethan continued texting every hour. "We need to discuss this privately. Don't involve the board. You're overreacting. Vanessa means nothing." That last message almost impressed me with its dishonesty, considering he'd apparently bought her property overlooking the Aegean Sea. At 4:43 p.m., Vanessa finally contacted me herself. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," her message read. "Ethan said your marriage was basically over." I reread that line twice because it revealed something unexpectedly useful. She genuinely believed him. Which meant Ethan had been lying to both of us simultaneously, feeding each woman different versions of reality depending on what benefited him most. I responded with only one attachment, a scanned copy of our current marriage certificate dated 10 years earlier alongside the trust ownership filings for the Santorini property. Underneath, I typed a single sentence. "Enjoy the villa. Legally, it belongs to me." She never replied. 30 minutes later, Ethan appeared in the lobby of my hotel. I watched him through the glass elevator doors before he saw me sitting near the terrace bar. Navy linen shirt. Expensive sunglasses. Wedding ring still on his hand. He looked less guilty than angry, which somehow made everything clearer. Ethan approached slowly and lowered his voice the second he reached the table. "What exactly are you trying to do?" he asked. I folded my sunglasses carefully beside my drink. "Protect company assets," I answered. "And my name." He leaned closer. "Claire, if this reaches the board, it could damage everything we built." I held his gaze for several quiet seconds before speaking again. "No, Ethan," I said softly. "What damages everything is stealing from your company to impress your mistress on the island where you forgot your own anniversary." For the first time in our entire marriage, Ethan looked genuinely cornered. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Cornered. His jaw tightened slightly as people passed behind him carrying beach bags and sunglasses, unaware that one of Manhattan's most polished executives was watching his life unravel beside a hotel bar in Santorini. "Keep your voice down," he muttered. I almost smiled at that because I hadn't raised it once. Ethan sat across from me without permission and loosened the cuff of his shirt like pressure alone could solve the situation. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said carefully. "The property transfer can be reversed. The transfer isn't the problem." "Then what is?" I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "You built an entire second life using company funds and assumed I was too distracted to notice." His expression hardened. "I worked for everything we have." There it was. The sentence underneath every betrayal in our marriage. Ethan genuinely believed success belonged exclusively to the loudest person in the room. He forgot who stayed awake organizing investor documents before his presentations. Who negotiated our first office lease after his panic attack in the parking garage. Who structured the holding companies protecting his assets from liability exposure. He loved taking credit because he assumed invisible work didn't count. "You know what your problem is," he said suddenly. "You always need to feel smarter than everyone else." The irony almost exhausted me. Before I could respond, his phone rang. Daniel Reeves. Ethan declined the call immediately. Then it rang again. And again. By the fourth call, even Ethan realized ignoring the CFO during an active compliance review wasn't possible anymore. He answered with forced calm. "What?" I watched the color slowly drain from his face while Daniel spoke. Ethan stood abruptly and turned away toward the terrace edge overlooking the water. Even from several feet away, I caught fragments. Who authorized that? No, she wouldn't, Monday? Absolutely not. When he finally ended the call, he stayed facing the ocean for a long moment before returning to the table. The board scheduled an emergency review, he said quietly. They're auditing international expenditures before the merger meeting. I took another sip of coffee. That sounds serious. Ethan leaned both hands against the table. Claire, listen to me carefully. If this turns into a public investigation, the press will destroy everyone connected to the company. Including you. I'm aware. Then stop. This. I tilted my head slightly. Stop what exactly? The audit? The compliance review? Or your affair? His eyes flashed with anger then, but beneath it sat fear. Real fear. Because Ethan finally understood something important, this situation could no longer be controlled through charm, money, or selective truth. Corporate investigations leave paper trails. And Ethan had created too many of them. 2 hours later, I received an email marked confidential from Bennett Strategic Holdings legal counsel. Attached were 47 pages of flagged transactions tied to Ethan's executive account over the previous 8 months. Luxury resorts. Jewelry invoices. Chauffeur services. International flights. Hidden among them sat another discovery even Daniel apparently hadn't noticed yet. Vanessa Cole had been receiving unauthorized consulting payments through a subcontractor account disguised as market expansion analysis. Nearly $300,000. I stared at the number without reacting outwardly, though internally something cold settled permanently into place. This wasn't reckless cheating anymore. It was calculated fraud. Ethan returned to New York the following morning on the first available flight. Vanessa left separately 3 hours later after quietly checking out of their suite alone. I saw her once in the lobby before she left. No designer sunglasses now. No glowing smile. Just a frightened 26-year-old woman realizing she'd attached herself to a man whose entire image was beginning to crack publicly. She looked at me cautiously as she passed. I didn't know, she whispered. And strangely enough, I believed her. Ethan had lied professionally for years. That kind of man rarely limits deception to one area of his life. By the time my own flight landed in Manhattan that evening, 3 board members had already contacted me directly requesting private meetings before Monday's emergency review. But the most interesting message arrived at 11:38 p.m. from Daniel Reeves himself. There's something else you need to see before the meeting, it read. Attached was a PDF labeled, Executive Succession Contingency Plan. Ethan Bennett's name had already been removed from the top line. Monday morning, Manhattan looked polished and indifferent in the way it always does when powerful people are about to lose everything. Rain slid down the glass windows of Bennett Strategic Holdings while black town cars lined the curb outside the building. I arrived 12 minutes early wearing a navy silk dress Ethan once told me looked too understated for executive events. That comment returned to me as I stepped into the private elevator alone because understatement had always been mistaken for weakness in his world. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt unnaturally quiet. No casual small talk. No coffee laughter. Just folders, legal pads, and tightly controlled expressions. Ethan sat near the far end of the table beside corporate counsel, though no one was speaking to him directly anymore. The moment he saw me walk in, his shoulders stiffened. 3 days earlier he had been buying engagement-style jewelry for another woman in Santorini. Now he looked like a man waiting outside an operating room. Daniel Reeves stood when I entered. Claire, he said respectfully, sliding a folder toward my seat. Thank you for coming. Ethan noticed that too. Respect changes shape quickly when money and liability enter the conversation. The board chairwoman, Eleanor Whitmore, began the meeting without delay. We are here to discuss potential misuse of corporate funds, undisclosed liabilities, and fiduciary violations tied to executive accounts under Mr. Ethan Bennett. Hearing my husband reduced to legal terminology should have felt sadder than it did. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Over the next 90 minutes, transaction records filled the screens one by one. Resort invoices. Unauthorized reimbursements. Shell contractor payments linked to Vanessa. Escrow transfers for the Santorini villa. Every document made Ethan appear smaller somehow, like exposure itself physically reduced him. He tried defending the expenditures as client relationship investments until Eleanor interrupted him directly. Did your client also receive diamond jewelry and beachfront accommodations? The room went silent. Ethan looked toward me then, probably expecting satisfaction or cruelty or triumph. I gave him none. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Then Daniel introduced the final document, the ownership structure behind the Andrus Cove Property Trust. He explained it slowly for the board, outlining how Ethan had unknowingly routed the acquisition through a pre-existing trust structure legally controlled by me. Meaning, Eleanor clarified carefully, Mr. Bennett used company funds to purchase an asset his wife technically owns? Correct, Daniel answered. One board member actually laughed under his breath. Ethan closed his eyes briefly after that. By the end of the meeting, the vote happened faster than I expected. Executive suspension pending formal investigation. Immediate removal from merger negotiations. Temporary freezing of discretionary compensation accounts. Ethan didn't argue anymore once the decision became official. He just sat there staring at the table while attorneys discussed procedural timelines around him like surgeons speaking over a body already gone. As everyone slowly gathered their papers, Ethan finally spoke to me privately for the first time all morning. Was this your plan the entire time? He asked quietly. I considered the question honestly. No, I said. My plan was to trust my husband. That answer hurt him more than anything else had. Weeks later, the scandal reached financial media after merger documents leaked. Vanessa resigned before formal subpoenas were issued and disappeared from public view completely. Ethan's professional reputation survived technically. But only in the way buildings survive fires after the structure is already hollowed out inside. As for me, I kept the Santorini villa. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to surrender something purchased through my own silence, labor, and intelligence while another person assumed I wasn't paying attention. 6 months later, I returned there alone. Same restaurant. Same sunset. Same ocean glittering beneath white stone terraces. This time the reservation card carried only one name. Claire Bennett. The waiter smiled politely while pouring my wine and asked if I was celebrating something special. I looked out toward the water for a moment before answering softly, peace. People always imagine betrayal ends with screaming, slammed doors, or dramatic revenge. Mine ended with paperwork, silence, and a man realizing too late that the person he underestimated understood every detail of the life he built. Ethan spent years believing control belonged to whoever spoke the loudest in the room. But real control lives with the person paying attention while everyone else performs. After the investigation closed, several people asked if I regretted staying calm for so long. I never answered them directly because calm was never surrender. Calm was observation. It was patience. It was knowing emotional people reveal things strategic people simply collect. The truth is, by the time my husband noticed I had stopped speaking, I had already seen everything I needed to see. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is let people continue underestimating her while she quietly protects herself. And sometimes karma doesn't arrive as destruction. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. A signed document. A frozen account. A seat at the table they thought you'd never keep. If you've ever stayed silent while people underestimated you, subscribe. Because some stories deserve to be heard till the very end.